Good evening, everybody, or actually good very early Sunday morning here on the East Coast. This is Dave, and we are doing the message for City of Refuge for May the 2nd. I'm still doing the videos from home with everything that's still going on for COVID-19. I'm not going to really spend any time talking about any of that stuff tonight. You guys get inundated with that all day long, every day right now, and I'm sure, like me, you're probably sick of it. So I actually, tonight's message, I want to talk about Samson. To me, Samson is a very fascinating character in the Old Testament. It's really only talked about across four chapters in Judges, Judges 13 through 16. If you happen to grow up in church like I did, Samson was a figure that you may have heard about in your Sunday school class, although it was somewhat of probably an abridged version of Samson. I remember hearing about a mighty man with long hair that had never been cut, and who was a champion for Israel against the Philistines. He was betrayed by a woman he loved, and he ultimately sacrificed himself to strike a blow against those same Philistines. That's the story, right? Kind of. Sort of. Not exactly, but it's the version that kids get, I guess. Samson's life is kind of a wild study in contrast. He was consecrated from birth as a Nazirite, and for more about that, you can look in Numbers, in chapter 6. But yet he was plagued by lust, and he was seeking love in places he shouldn't have. He was a man in which God's Spirit moved mightily through to exact judgment on the Philistine nation, but he was also a man that did not live up to his full potential that was available due to his pretty much disobedient inclinations. It's an interesting picture for us as Christians to see that God can still work amazing things through someone, through the Spirit, even when we're not living up to our lives in an obedient fashion. And yet, how much greater are those things that can be worked through us if and when we are living in obedience? For Samson, it's clear right from his introduction that he would be special amongst the people, and that the Lord had a very specific purpose on his life. I'm going to read to you in Judges, starting in chapter 13. Verses 1 to 5. I'm reading out of the New King James. You can read out of along in something that you like. If you like New King James, great. If you like Old King James, great. If you like one of the other versions, NIV or NASV or ESV, whatever, as long as you're reading your Bible. And somebody can talk to me about more of that later. I read out of the New King James because I like it. Anyway, Judges chapter 13, starting at verse 1. And it says, "Again the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. Now there was a certain man from Zorah, of the family of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Indeed, now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now therefore, please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, and not to eat anything unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazirite to God from the womb. And he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Philistines." So the people of Israel, once again, are doing things their own way. They have decided that they want to chase after whatever seems right in their own eyes, in the idolatry of their hearts, and they've been subjugated to Philistine rule for 40 years now, because they would rather look to the idols than look to the Lord. And in the midst of this, the angel of the Lord appears to the barren wife of Manoah, a Danite, and tells her that a son will be born to her, and he will begin to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Philistines. I think the word begin is important, as it indicates that it won't be fully accomplished by Samson. But he will be the spark that starts that fire of rebellion. Oh, also, he'll be consecrated as a Nazirite from birth, and you have to share in that while you're in the pregnancy period. You need to make sure that you abstain from eating or touching anything unclean, and from eating or drinking anything from the grapevine or any other similar strong drink. That seems like a lot to process, right? I mean, it seems like a lot to take in all at once. You're being visited by someone who is awesome in appearance, someone who you immediately see something is different about. She doesn't question or ask any questions to the angel, though. And I'm sure she had many, but she goes to tell her husband exactly what transpired, which we see as we move forward. Judges 13 down to verse 6. So the woman came and told her husband, saying, "A man of God came to me, and his countenance was like the countenance of the angel of God. Very awesome. But I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name. And he said to me, Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now drink no wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death." Then Manoah prayed to the Lord and said, "O my Lord, please let the man of God whom you sent come to us and teach us what we shall do for the child who will be born." So Manoah hears all that his wife has to say about the matter, and you can imagine what might be running through his mind after she finishes recounting her story. "That's quite a story, dear. Are you feeling okay? Have you been out in the sun too long today? It sounds like you're starting to see things." That is certainly an attitude that Manoah could have had. Okay, this is a lot to process, and I'm not sure what to make of this. I mean, it sounds like a tale spun out of a combination of a daydream and an earnest desire to have a child. I know in a previous message we talked about the fact that being childless was something that was very hard to bear in the culture of this time. That meant that you weren't able to continue your line. You weren't able to give your family, a continued existence if they could have no son to bear the name. In this particular time period, a man could have more than one wife. So a wife that could not bear children was especially stigmatized, both with the husband and also among the other wives, as somebody who might be talked about. And that's not specified in the text. I'm definitely speculating on some of those things, but I can imagine all of these thoughts going through his head. He doesn't say outright that he disbelieves her claim, but he doesn't have a level of faith where he accepts it outright either. Instead, he prays and asks God to confirm by sending the angel back so he can hear the message for himself. "Hey, I really just want to know, Lord, can you do that for me, to confirm that for me?" We saw something similar in Judges, where Gideon tests the Lord a few times, to the point where I would have, if I were the Lord, I would have gotten a little bit peeved at Gideon for continuing to ask. I'm not God, though, and God continued to be patient with him in that moment. But as we see here, moving forward in Judges chapter 13, starting in verse 9, the Lord hears Manoah's request, and he answers it. It said, "And God listened to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came to the woman again as she was sitting in the field. But Manoah, her husband, was not with her. Then the woman ran in haste and told her husband and said to him, 'Look, the man who came to me the other day has just now appeared to me.' So Manoah arose and followed his wife, and when he came to the man, he said to him, 'Are you the man who spoke to this woman?' And he said, 'I am.' Manoah said, 'Let your words come to pass. What will the boy's rule of what will be his work?' And so the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, 'Of all that I said to the woman, let her be careful. She may not eat anything that comes from the vine, nor may she drink wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean. All that I have commanded her, let her observe.' Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, 'Please let us detain you, and we will prepare a young goat for you.' And the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, 'Though you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you offer a burnt offering, you must offer it to the Lord.' For Manoah did not know he was the angel of the Lord. Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, 'What is your name, that when your words come to pass, we may honor you?' And the angel of the Lord said to him, 'Why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful?'" So God sees fit to honor this prayer, and the angel of the Lord again appears to Manoah's wife, and she promptly gets her husband, who confirms that this is indeed the man who appeared to his wife and proclaimed this great news. He also asks, "What will the boy's work and station be in life?" But this is not something that's revealed to him. God does not reveal that information to him. The angel simply repeats what he stated about the Nazirite vow, and the instruction for his wife to follow that information throughout the pregnancy. Manoah begs the angel to stay that they might prepare a meal for him, but he refuses to eat or reveal his name and advises a proper sacrifice to the Lord instead, which is an important point because at this point Israel is doing all kinds of crazy stuff, and they are not always following after the Lord. In fact, as we read at the beginning, they're doing whatever feels right in their own eyes, which means they basically go after whatever seems good to them. If it's this idol this week who might do something for me, then I'll do an offering for them. Oh, this one seems favorable in this season, so I'll an offering to that god. The angel of the Lord, which when we see angel of the Lord specifically in the Old Testament, is often ascribed to be Jesus appearing before his birth on earth, a Christophany, if you will. Basically says, hey, I'm not going to eat your food. That's not something that's going to happen. But if you're going to make an offering, that's fine. It has to be an offering to the Lord, to Adonai, to Jehovah. It has to be a proper offering to God. And so, as we're going to see, that is what Manoah will do. Moving down to verse 19 of chapter 13. So Manoah took the young goat with the grain offering and offered it upon the rock to the Lord. And he did a wondrous thing while Manoah and his wife looked on. It happened as the flame went up toward heaven from the altar, the angel of the Lord ascended in the flame of the altar. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell on their faces to the ground. When the angel of the Lord appeared no more to Manoah and his wife, then Manoah knew that he was the angel of the Lord. And Manoah said to his wife, surely we shall die because we have seen God. But his wife said to him, if the Lord had desired to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands, nor would he have shown us all these things, nor would he have told us such things as these at this time. And so the woman bore a son, and she called his name Samson. And the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Manahadan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. Manoah makes his burnt offering to the Lord, and an incredible thing happens. The angel of the Lord ascended to heaven in the flames rising from the altar. Can you imagine seeing that? I mean, literally, all of a sudden this man, or what appears to be a man standing before you, rises up and ascends into heaven in the flame of the altar as it burns and rises up. That had to have been quite a shock to them. They both fell down face first in worship, realizing that they had been in the presence of the angel of the Lord. Manoah exclaimed they would surely die, having seen the face of the Lord, which is a reference to Exodus chapter 33. But his wife provides a little bit more of an encouraging response. It's like, if the Lord wanted to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted our offering or shown and told us all the wonderful things he's planning to do. That's a pretty rational, decent response from her. One sec. My Dickey's cup from Dickey's Barbecue that we stopped at on our New Orleans trip a few years ago. That's a bit of trivia for those out there. So, Samson is born and grows up. That is literally the jump that is made in the text. Samson is born at the end of chapter 13. At the beginning of chapter 14, Samson is looking for a wife. Like I said, Samson's story takes place in 4 chapters in Judges, between 13 and 16, and it is a fascinating story, and I would love to sit here and just read you all of the text from the remaining 3 chapters, but I'm going to kind of summarize them for you and encourage you to read all of Judges 13 to 16 to get the full story. Samson's looking for a wife, and he sees the Philistine woman, and he instantly falls in love with her, a veritable love at first sight reaction. He tells his father he wants to meet her as a wife and to make the arrangements, because that's what families did then. The father would make an arrangement with the bride-to-be's father, and they would set up the wedding. His parents are not thrilled by his choice. Hey, isn't there a nice girl among the daughters of our people you'd rather have? Why are you after one of those people? And I imagine it in the voice of, if you've ever seen any number of things, but definitely The Big Bang Theory with Howard's mom. So can't you find a nice Jewish girl? You know, and it's just, why are you after one of them? Samson, however, does not relent. He's like, no, that's the one I want. That's the girl I saw that I like. Make that happen. His parents, and even Samson, doesn't realize that this is something that the Lord is moving in. Some would say that the Lord has condoned the marriage. I don't know if I would go that far, because it does explicitly lay out in the law that they're supposed to, the Israelites are supposed to keep to their own people, and they're not supposed to go after the daughters of the surrounding nations, and they're not supposed to give their daughters to the sons of those people. So I wouldn't necessarily say that God is condoning it, but God is looking for a reason to act against the Philistines, and he is going to use this in the fact that Samson is going to marry a Philistine. I think it does also show us that Samson is exercising his freedom to make his own choices. Samson is not a robot automaton in God's hands doing whatever the Maker asks him to do. Samson is making decisions, bad ones at that. And said, but God's still going to use those choices to bring about his plan and his timing. He is not handicapped by our poor decision making. If you take anything away tonight and today, whatever, from this, know that God is not handicapped by our poor decision making. He can still bring things about in his timing the way he needs to. So Samson traveled to the city of Timnah to see his bride-to-be. And on the way, he was near a vineyard, and a young lion attacks him. As a Nazirite, Samson should have steered clear of vineyards, because he's not supposed to drink anything made from the vine, and he's not supposed to eat anything made from the vine. So he was in a place where he could be tempted, and I find it interesting that the lion attacks here. It's almost a warning to avoid that nearby temptation. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him mightily in that moment, and he tears the lion apart with his bare hands. And that had to have been something for him to have all of a sudden felt that rush, that supernatural power that God lays on him, to basically react in that way, and he tears the lion apart. A short while later, he's returning. He stops off to see the corpse, because that's something that's still weighing on his mind. That's something that happened. He didn't tell anybody what happened, and he doesn't. So he comes back, and he notices in the carcass of the lion there are wild bees in a swarm, and there's honey in a honeycomb inside the carcass of the lion, which he takes and eats, because that's what you do, right? You go into the corpse and you pull out the honeycomb and you decide to eat it. That sounds like a wonderful idea. No. But it's an even doubly unwonderful idea for Samson, because he is not supposed to touch anything that's unclean and dead, and he is not supposed to eat anything that's unclean. And in this instance, the honey would have been unclean because it was inside the carcass of a lion, which was dead, so he's not supposed to be handling that. But he takes it, and he eats it, and he takes it to his parents, and he offers it to them. So not only is he breaking a part of his Nazirite vow, but he's making his parents complicit in it by not telling them where the honeycomb came from. Excuse me. So, finally, the wedding is upon us. Samson throws a feast. The bride's people brought him 30 companions to feast with him, because really, who's going to turn down an invitation to a party that lasts for a week? During the feast, Samson poses a riddle to the attendees with a prize of 30 changes of clothes, which is 30 nice suits at this point, and he has them stumped with this one. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. They can't figure this out. They're looking at it, they're like, okay, we don't get it. And they're all drinking, because this is a feast after all, which again is something from Samson's perspective. It doesn't explicitly say that he was also drinking, but the temptation is there, and he's put himself in a position where he can also do something that breaks the covenant that he has set up as part of his vow. So the people of the Philistines, they can't figure out the riddle, so they resort to intimidation of Samson's new bride to get the answer so they don't lose the bet. They basically say, hey, find out the answer to the riddle, because if you don't, we're going to burn you and your father to death. That's some strong kind of motivation for you to try to find out, what is the answer to this riddle. So she pesters him to no end. She basically tells you don't love me, you only hate me, because you won't tell me the answer to the riddle. And he's like, I didn't tell my parents, why should I tell you? But finally, he relents and reveals the answer to the riddle for her, which she then promptly goes and tells the other Philistines. And they answer the riddle before the time runs out. Samson refers to his wife as a cow, and he goes off to get them their 30 suits by killing 30 other Philistines. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him in this instance, moving against the Philistines in this. God uses Samson's kind of burning anger and passion against them. And then Samson goes back home. He gives them their suits of clothes, and he goes back home, because he's still a little bit perturbed that this happened. Meanwhile, his new father-in-law decides to give his bride to the best man in marriage instead. Which is weird to me, but must have made sense at the time. A little while later, Samson remembers he got married, and he goes down to see his wife. But her father refuses to let him, and he tells Samson, hey, I thought you truly hated her, so I gave her to your best man. Why don't you take her younger sister instead? She's better anyway. Samson's not impressed with this answer. And his anger burns against the Philistines in a mighty way. He catches 300 foxes, or possibly jackals, depending on, which is probably a better translation of the word there. He ties them together in pairs by their tails with a torch between them, lights the torches, and then sets them loose in the Philistine wheat fields to run for their lives, burning down the entire harvest, as well as vineyards and olive groves. In his anger, he cripples their local economy. It's also worth noting that in this instance, this is all Samson. There is no mention that the Spirit of the Lord is upon him in directing this attack. Samson got mad, and he got creative. He decided, I'm going to let all of this go, and it burns it out. So, of course, you can understand that the Philistines are super pissed. Who did this to us? And when they find out it's because Samson's father-in-law gave away his bride to someone else, they promptly set them both on fire and burn them to death. Samson's not impressed with that response, and he attacks the Philistines hip and thigh, which is an old expression which means he was merciless in slaughtering them. And then he retreated to a cave in Edom. He's kind of a loner at this point. It's interesting to note as we go through all of this story that everything Samson does, he does on his own. Sometimes in the power of the Spirit of the Lord, and sometimes on his own thinking and power, but everything he does by himself. He's not leading an army, he's not inspiring other people, he's not bringing other people to his cause. He's doing everything on his own. The Philistines are not going to let this lie. It does not sit well with them what's happened. So they send men to Judah to apprehend Samson. They line up at Lehi, and they're arrayed for battle, and Judah is looking at this going, whoa, ho, ho, what's going on? What are we doing? Why are you coming against us in battle? We are already subject to you. What's happening? They want to prevent problems. They're more concerned about appeasing their oppressors rather than kind of rallying to somebody who could deliver them. And they send 3,000 men to collect Samson in order to turn him over to the Philistines. It's interesting here that Samson willingly goes with them. He basically has his only caveat in this is that they do not kill him themselves. He doesn't want to be killed by the men of Judah, by his own people. He basically says no, and they say, nope, we're not going to kill you. We're just going to tie you up and bind you, and we're going to take you back to the Philistines and turn you over and let them mete out whatever justice they might feel is appropriate. When they bring him up to Lehi, the Philistines rush to take him. Samson breaks his bindings like they're made of thread. And he picks this, and at that point, the Spirit of the Lord again moves mightily upon him. He picks up the jawbone of an ass and he kills 1,000 Philistines with it. I'm trying to imagine the carnage that he causes among all these men as he stands among them and brings about their death, swinging nothing but the donkey's jawbone. It's a staggering image. In a few short verses later, we see Samson reminded of his humanity, though, and a need for something outside himself, and need to rely on God for deliverance. He cries out in prayer for water. It feels like kind of a whiny prayer, to be honest. I've done all this mighty stuff, and you're going to let me die of thirst out here and be subject to uncircumcised men. The Lord answers, though, and he splits a rock, a cleft in a rock, and water comes out. And Samson has. Samson was not invincible. And I think that's important to remember. Samson was not invincible, and his strength was not his own, but supernaturally given. Samson's strength was in the covenant he had with the Lord through the Nazirite consecration. He was still a terribly flawed and more often beholden to his own lust and passions rather than to his obedience to that covenant. I like to think that Samson was not some conventional strongman. He wasn't a Hercules. He wasn't a bodybuilder, strongman competitor type that you might think of when you think of Samson and all the images that you may have seen of Samson over the years as some big muscled Conan the Barbarian looking whatever. That was not, I don't personally think that that was Samson. I think Samson was a kind of unassuming person. Obviously had some things going for him. Maybe he still looked pretty good. I don't know. But he was not the conventional strong type, because it's obvious in looking at the rest of the text that the Philistines wanted to know where his great strength came from, which means that they weren't quite certain by looking at him. It wasn't because he was super muscled. He didn't look like Goliath. He looked more like David, if we want to use another comparison from Scripture. His strength came from the Spirit of the Lord, and that same Holy Spirit that resides in us as believers and followers of Christ. As we go through the more familiar stories for Samson, or the most familiar story, I should say, not more familiar, the most familiar story for Samson, Samson's always looking for love in the wrong places. At the beginning of chapter 16, he is in Gaza and he goes to see a prostitute. And the men of the city are like, Samson is here. We're going to kill him. We're going to wait around here through the evening, and then come morning, we're going to overtake him and kill him. Around midnight, Samson gets up and he pulls the entire city gates out of their holdings, pulls it all up out of the ground, and carries it on his shoulders out to Hebron. That's an amazing image, that he just really picks up the gates of the city and carries it away to remove himself from the situation. Then he fell in love with Delilah. This part of Samson's story confuses me and is also terribly relatable at the same time. He was clearly in love with her, and she was clearly in love with money. Maybe not at first. Maybe there was a shared passion at the beginning of their time together. But when the lords of the Philistines approached her and offered her 1,100 shekels of silver, which is about 3 years' worth of wages, she definitely loved the money more. And so she begins to ask him about the source of his great strength. 3 separate times she does this, and Samson gives her a different answer each time. He clearly feels like something is up, because he's not being honest with her. He tells her first that it's like, oh, if they tie me up with 7 fresh bowstrings, then I'll be helpless. So she does that, and he snaps them and gets away. And then she's like, well, you don't love me. You didn't tell me where the real source of your strength is. And then he says, new ropes that have never been used. If I'm tied up with those, then I'll be weak and helpless, and they'll be able to overtake me. That happens. He snaps the ropes like they're nothing. He gets away. I don't know why he continues to play the game at that point. After the first time, I don't think I would have done this again. But then the third time, he tells her, well, if you bind my 7 locks into the web of a loom, then I won't be able to get away. That's bogus. He gets away. And so, why did he stay with her? Why did he keep playing this game? Maybe he thought he couldn't be captured. Maybe he was a bit arrogant and too secure in his own self, in his own mind, rather than in the strength coming from the Lord. She finally nags him and torments him so much that he relents. And he tells her about the Nazirite vow. He tells her that, hey, I've been consecrated as a Nazirite to God since birth. My hair has never been cut. A razor has never touched my head. If my hair is cut off, my head shaved, then I will become weak and I will lose the power of the Lord. And so this time she's like, "Whoa, that really sounds like the truth. He's told me all that is in his heart." So she tells the Lord, come back. This time I know I have him. You'll be able to take him. She lulls him to sleep. She gets someone to cut his hair. And the Spirit of the Lord leaves him. I think it is, for me, the hair thing, because I've seen multiple different images. Samson didn't have long flowing hair necessarily. Samson probably had something that looked more like dreadlocks, because he says the 7 locks. So he probably had 7 big locks bound up on his head. The hair was a symbol of the vow. So the hair was not the source of the strength. The hair was a symbol of the vow that was made. And at this point, it's the last condition of the vow that has not been compromised, has not been broken. Once his hair is cut off, the covenant is broken and the power of the Lord leaves him. And he doesn't realize it at first. She tells him the same thing that's happened the other 3 times. Samson, the Philistines are upon you. He thinks he can break out. He can't. They capture him. They gouge out his eyes. So Samson is imprisoned, and he's forced to turn a grist mill in the prison. And the Philistines think they've won a great victory. They are celebrating. They are beside themselves, patting themselves on the back. We've got him. This man who has been a thorn in our side. Excuse me, and tormented us and multiplied our dead. We have him. And it's a victory for our God over the God of Israel. It's a victory for Dagon. All the while they're doing this, Samson's hair is starting to grow back. And maybe Samson's hope is starting to be rekindled a little bit. But the Philistines are still reveling in that. Somebody else, one of the commentaries I read while going through some of this today, if I were the Philistines and I was told that the source of his strength was in the hair that was growing on his head, I would have been sending a guy in to shave that head and shave his face every day, to make sure that he stayed smooth as a baby's bottom, and they don't do that though, because they're not really, they're content in their wickedness. They feel like they've won. They hold a great feast celebrating Dagon. They are celebrating Dagon's victory over the Lord. And there are about 3,000 men and women. All of the lords of the Philistines are gathered together in the temple of Dagon. And they call to have Samson come out and perform for them. They want him to be a little trick pony that they can poke and prod at, and they can revel in the fact that we beat this guy. They obviously didn't think he was a threat anymore, because they only have a young child leading him around because he can't see, because since they poked his eyes out. Samson asked the young lad, he said, "Can you please put my hands on the support pillars? I want to feel the temple. I want to feel the pillars of the temple." So he does, and Samson prays, and he asks the Lord for one final burst of strength to allow him to take out these Philistines, to take vengeance for my eyes that were taken from me. Let me die with these Philistines. And he pushes with all his might one last final time, and he brings the entire temple down. He kills everyone in attendance, including himself. So it says that he killed more people in his death than he did throughout his life. So what do we take away from this? So like I said, that's a crazy story, and I love reading these stories in this history in the Old Testament. I think there's a lot of stuff that we can take for it. I think that we see the same cycle of idolatry that the Israelites dealt with. Sometimes we struggle with in our own hearts from time to time. But I would encourage you at this time to remember that your past does not disqualify you from being of service to the Lord. God uses people for his purpose in mighty ways, even when their hearts and actions might be far from him. God is not hindered in his purposes by our decisions. He isn't tripped up and frustrated when we don't act in obedience. He would prefer that we do, and it would go so much better for us if we did. With that, like I said, I would also say his work is much more powerfully evident to us when we are acting in obedience. God was able to begin delivering Israel out from under the rule of the Philistines through Samson's life, despite the fact that Samson was led more by his passions than by obedience to his calling. how much greater might it have been, though, if Samson had taken the calling more seriously? Can you imagine how much more amazing it could have been for Samson if he had actually been serious about the vow that he was in? Much like Samuel later is a Nazirite in one way, and John the Baptist is a Nazirite. For that. So I think if Samson had took his calling more seriously, if he had lived in full obedience to his vow to the Lord, things might have been really even more amazing for that. But even with the limited obedience, he is still accounted for in the Hebrews Hall of Faith, chapter 11. My exhortation to us in this recounting of Samson's life is that our potential is great in the Lord, and we will unlock the fullness of it in our obedience to him. So that's my hope for you guys with the message today. You have such amazing potential, and God is going to do amazing things for you and amazing things in the world around us. He would like to partner with us to make that happen. Part of the way that we make that happen in the best way possible is to live in obedience. To the Lord and his calling in our life. Obedience is better than sacrifice, as we have mentioned many other times. God's not impressed by the things that we do and the suffering that we go through necessarily. He wasn't impressed in Israel with all of the sacrifices they did. I want your hearts to be obedient to what I have called you to. In our time now, he wants us to be obedient because greater things are possible. So I encourage you in that. Please read through all of Judges 4:13 to 16 for all of Samson's story. I had a lot of it, but it's cool. All of Judges is great. All of the judges that happened in Israel had some amazing things. It's just crazy to me to think about that the same cycle repeats over and over again. They do their own thing. Something bad happens to them. They cry out to the Lord. God sends someone to deliver them out from under it. Everything is okay for a little while, and then they repeat. TLDR version that we joke about every now and again and say, okay, don't do the things. We did the things. Guys, so be encouraged in the fact that your past does not disqualify you. I know that comes up a lot for some people. It feels like sometimes that, oh, I've done all these terrible things. There's no way that God could ever want to use me. Not true. Don't, even in the time when you have accepted the Lord and you fall down, it's like, oh, I really messed up so much that I can never be used again. I should just not try. Please don't give up. Please be encouraged that God can still do amazing things through you, and you can always repent and come back. He's not keeping a tally up there of all the times you messed up before, and he's not keeping the tally now that you have been saved. God's not keeping record of those things in that way. Be encouraged that you have great potential. And you're still going to be used, but when you're obedient and when you're following the things that the Lord has laid out for us, those things can be even greater than you can imagine. I hope to see you guys in person really soon. Just ask that you would pray for the continuing covering of the Lord over us, that he would continue to keep us safe. And I love you guys, and thanks for listening.